Ashley is a high-end corporate lawyer who actually understands the weight of Justin's potential. Unlike some people who prefer to waste their lives measuring air pollution and playing with water samples, my mother-in-law, Kimberly, announced. Her voice carried that particular frequency of old-money condescension that she had perfected over decades, a tone designed to strip the flesh off a person without ever raising the volume. She placed her manicured hand on the young socialite's shoulder with a proprietary smugness, parading her like a prize pony at a county fair. I sat directly across from them, presiding over a Thanksgiving table I had paid for, down to the last heirloom silver fork and the imported linen napkins that Kimberly was currently twisting in her fingers. The woman she introduced as my replacement wore a deep emerald dress that perfectly matched the Savannah moss draping the oaks outside the window. She smiled at my husband, Justin, with a perfection that had clearly been practiced in front of a mirror for hours. She was the picture of the dutiful, fertile wife Kimberly had always demanded. What Kimberly didn't know was that I hadn't been measuring air pollution for the last 6 months. I had been conducting a different kind of environmental assessment. I was measuring the toxicity of this family, and the results were fatal. "How fascinating," I said, my voice steady, betraying nothing of the calculation running through my mind. I passed Ashley the homemade cranberry sauce, the crystal bowl heavy in my hand. Environmental engineering is quite similar to law, actually. We both spend a lot of time identifying toxic waste before it destroys the surrounding environment. Sometimes the contamination is in the water. Sometimes it's sitting at the dinner table. Madison, my sister-in-law, let out a sharp, jagged laugh that sounded like glass breaking. She swirled her wine, a vintage Bordeaux I had purchased at auction for this specific meal. "Please, Lauren, don't try to elevate your little job. Your sterile career is nothing compared to the legacy this family carries." Ashley wants 4 children. She's actually fertile. She understands that a woman's duty is to the bloodline, not to a laboratory. I buttered my roll with a calm that bordered on the clinical. I watched the butter melt into the warm bread, observing the physics of it. The air in the room was thick with the scent of jasmine and betrayal, a cloying sweetness meant to mask the rot underneath. For 7 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family. I had footed the bill for their arrogance, their legacy, and their lifestyle, all while they treated me like a guest in my own home. They thought I was silent because I was weak. They didn't realize I was silent because I was gathering data. Have you ever been treated like a guest in your own home, or made to feel invisible by the people who are supposed to love you? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I want to know who else has survived a family like this. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to match Madison's shrillness or Kimberly's passive-aggressive hum. Arguing implies that there is a negotiation to be had, and I was finished negotiating. I simply placed my knife down the heavy silver handle, feeling like dead weight against the fine china, and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim candlelight. The table fell silent, the tension snapping tight like a cable under too much tension. Kimberly's eyes darted to the screen, her survival instincts flaring even if she didn't understand why. My thumb hovered over the banking app, specifically the pending transaction for the catering company currently staffing the kitchen. With clinical precision, I hit cancel on the payment. $3,924 instantly remained in my account, revoked from theirs. "What are you doing?" Justin hissed, his face flushing a deep, mottled red that clashed with his silk tie. He looked at the phone as if it were a grenade. I set the device down next to my plate, screen up, letting the notification glow between us. "I'm auditing the accounts." "Justin, since your mother has already drafted my replacement and announced her specifications to the board, I figured it was time to stop funding the theater production. The budget for this farce has been cut to 0, effective immediately." Kimberly's Botoxed forehead managed a twitch, a ripple in the synthetic perfection of her face. "Don't be crass. Lauren, money talk at dinner is beneath us. It's vulgar. What's actually beneath us is the ground this estate sits on," I replied, my voice steady enough to cut diamonds. I turned my gaze to Ashley, the replacement, whose smile was beginning to fray at the edges like cheap fabric. "Did they forget to mention the deed to you, Ashley? Or did they lead you to believe this was a family asset, passed down through the glorious male line. I took a sip of water, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. This house was inherited from my grandmother 2 years before Justin and I even met. It is premarital property. The deed is in my name. The taxes are paid by my firm. It is ironclad and entirely mine. Justin opened his mouth to speak, likely to spin one of his usual narratives about our partnership, but I held up a hand. And let's be very clear for our guest. Since transparency is so important in legal matters, my husband isn't a provider. He is a tenant. He pays me rent every month below market rate. Because I'm not heartless, but it is recorded, legal, and separate. He has never owned a single brick of this legacy you're so proud of. The smell of jasmine in the room suddenly felt suffocating, a floral mask slipping away to reveal the decay. The heavy cutlery, the vintage wine, the prestige they bragged about it was all a subscription they'd been charging to my account while calling me useless. I realized then that my compassion hadn't been a virtue. It had been a resource they had exploited until the well ran dry. I was closing the tap. I watched the color drain from Madison's face, her hand hovering over a piece of heirloom silver that I had polished and protected with my own hands. For 7 years, I had performed the role of the quiet, helpful daughter-in-law. I had swallowed their insults like bitter medicine, convinced that if I just endured enough, the symptoms of their disdain would fade. Looking at them now, I realized that my endurance hadn't been weakness. It was a survival strategy born of necessity, a phenomenon I recognized from my studies as learned helplessness, but weaponized. I had been like a prisoner in a house without bars, bound by the hope that if I just gave enough, if I just proved my utility, I would eventually belong. I had worn my silence like armor, believing it kept me safe, when in reality, it only kept me compliant. But that invisible chain had finally snapped under the weight of tonight's disrespect. "Do you want to talk about useless, Madison?" I asked, my voice devoid of the tremor she probably expected. "Should we discuss the $900,000 of invisible labor I've poured into this family to keep your facade from crumbling?" The table went dead silent. The only sound was the clinking of ice in a glass as Ashley shifted uncomfortably, like the $48,000 I quietly wired to cover Richard's gambling debts last winter. I glanced at my father-in-law, a man I had once respected, who suddenly found the pattern on the tablecloth fascinating. I paid that not because I approved of his vice, but so your legacy wouldn't be stained by a foreclosure notice in the Sunday paper. I saved this family from public ruin, and you didn't even know the bill was due. Richard shrank in his chair, the patriarch reduced to a debtor. Or perhaps the $60,000 in annual socialite perks I've been funding for you, Madison? I continued, the facts flowing like a ledger being read in open court. The country club dues? The internships in Paris that were really just shopping trips? I've been funding those while you mocked my sterile engineering career. I've been the venture capitalist keeping your moral bankruptcy afloat, footing the bill for your arrogance while you looked down on the very hands that fed you. I finally turned my eyes to Justin. He sat there, his senior project manager title hanging around his neck like a millstone. And you. Your entire career is a hollow shell, supported entirely by the contracts my firm has steered toward your father's company. Without my sign-offs, your division doesn't exist. For years, I had stayed silent, absorbing their cruelty as the cost of keeping a peace that was never real. I thought I was building a bridge, but I was just digging a hole. Tonight, I stopped digging. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a final reconciliation of the books. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for nearly a decade, and today, their credit limit had finally been reached. I sat back, my posture as rigid and precise as one of my engineering schematics, while the shock at the table curdled into a fresh, ugly desperation. Kimberly didn't apologize. She didn't weep or ask for forgiveness. Instead, her eyes narrowed into predatory slits, the mask of the refined southern matriarch slipping to reveal the viper underneath. "You think you can just buy your way out of this family, Lauren?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're mentally unstable. This little performance, it's proof. No one will believe you. We are the pillars of this community." By the next morning, the stagnant savanna air felt thick with more than just humidity. It was heavy with the smog of rumors. Kimberly had already begun her counteroffensive, moving through our social circles with the practiced grace of a seasoned gossip. My phone buzzed incessantly with concerned messages from people I barely knew, foundation board members, neighbors, even the pastor's wife. Kimberly was painting a masterpiece of fiction. I was professionally fraudulent, emotionally unhinged, perhaps even suffering from a break with reality due to my infertility. She was trying to strip me of the only thing she couldn't buy, my professional reputation. Then came the texts from Justin. They weren't pleas for forgiveness. They were masterpieces of gaslighting designed to destabilize my reality. I only looked for something else because you were so cold, Lauren. You were always at the lab. A man needs to feel like a priority, not a water sample. Ashley understands that. You drove me to this. He actually tried to blame his infidelity, the charges I'd tracked on the corporate card at high-end spas during his supposed overnight site visits on my work ethic. He tried to frame his betrayal as a consequence of my success. Tears would have been inefficient. Panic would have been a waste of energy. I sat in my home office, the scent of blooming jasmine outside the window, now a sickening reminder of the rot within these walls. I ignored every single notification. I didn't reply to the rumors. I didn't defend myself against the lies. Instead, I went back to my spreadsheet. Every lie they told, every dollar they spent, every text message sent was just another data point. Another entry in the ledger I was preparing for court. I wasn't having an emotional collapse. I was conducting a forensic audit of their destruction. The ironclad prenup sat on my mahogany desk like a loaded weapon, its white pages gleaming under the study lamp. It was a document Justin had signed 7 years ago with a laugh, confident he would never need it because he assumed he would always be the one with the power. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone and dialed the number I had saved for this exact contingency. By noon, the first strike was delivered. Justin was at his office, a space my connection secured for him when the process server arrived. He was served with an official eviction notice from the estate and a massive civil lawsuit for $900,000 in misappropriated legacy funds. The real shock, however, came during the preliminary meeting at the law firm later that afternoon. Kimberly marched in, flanked by Justin, expecting to bully a settlement out of me. They stopped dead when the door opened. Ashley, the replacement Kimberly had introduced with such pride at Thanksgiving, walked into the room. She wasn't wearing the emerald dress or the vapid smile of a socialite. She was wearing a charcoal power suit and carrying a briefcase. She walked past them, ignored their gasps, and sat down on my side of the table. "Kimberly, Justin," Ashley said, her voice cool and professional. "I believe we've met." Though under slightly different pretenses, Ashley wasn't Justin's future wife. She was my primary legal counsel, a shark in the world of high-stakes divorce litigation. She had been playing the role of the fertile socialite for weeks, acting as a double agent to document every boastful admission of financial greed Kimberly and Justin uttered when they thought they were safe. I watched Kimberly's face crumble. It was a stark lesson in the power illusion of an empty wallet. For years, she had mistaken having money for being someone of substance. She believed her status was an intrinsic quality of her bloodline, an armor that could not be pierced, but her authority was a mere shell, a facade purchased with the very funds she had been siphoning from my estate. When the financial mask was stripped away, she didn't have the inner character to remain upright. Her legacy wasn't a mountain. It was a pile of sand held together by my bank account. They weren't shocked by the betrayal of family. They were simply paralyzed because I had finally stopped playing along with the theater. They realized, in that cold conference room, that they were not the masters of the game. They were merely pieces on a board I had owned from the start. Ashley opened her briefcase, the click of the latches sounding like gunshots in the quiet room. She didn't produce a settlement offer or a plea for reconciliation. She slid a single document across the polished table. It was a forensic accounting report, thick with highlighted transactions and scanned signatures. "Did you think we wouldn't check the trust fund?" I asked, my voice calm, factual, lethal. "The environmental project fund Richard set up for me 3 years ago? The one meant to clean up the waterways you claim to love so much?" Justin's arrogance evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sickly pallor that made him look 10 years older. He reached for the paper, his hands trembling. That was a misunderstanding. We were managing it for you, moving assets to protect them. Managing it by forging Richard's signature? Ashley interjected, leaning forward. She pointed to a series of transfers that authorized withdrawals directly into Kimberly's personal offshore accounts. That elevates this from a civil dispute to a felony investigation. We're not just talking about divorce court anymore, Justin. We're talking about federal charges, wire fraud, identity theft, embezzlement. The legacy they clung to was stripped away, layer by rot-filled layer. They weren't just greedy, they were criminals. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Their power, their status, their entire identity was built on crimes committed against the very people they claimed to love. They hadn't just stolen money, they had stolen trust, and the law has a very specific way of dealing with that. My father, Justin whispered, his voice cracking. Does he know? He does now, I replied, my gaze unyielding. I showed him the evidence this morning. And unlike you, he understands the value of integrity. He's already agreed to testify against you to save what little honor his name has left. The rain started at dusk, a relentless torrential downpour that mirrored the storm tearing through the estate's remaining peace. I was in my study, finalizing the conversion plans to turn the East Wing into the new research center, when the security alert pinged on my tablet. I glanced at the monitor. Kimberly stood at the main gate. Her usually immaculate hair was plastered to her skull, mascara running in dark streaks down her face like war paint gone wrong. She looked smaller, stripped of the armor of her status, shivering in a coat that cost more than most people's cars but couldn't keep her warm now. I walked to the front door but didn't open it. I watched through the reinforced glass as she pounded on the heavy oak, her voice muffled by the storm and the thickness of the door. Please, Lauren. Justin. They're going to take him away. The FBI is at the office. You can stop this. Just drop the charges. We're family. Behind her, Justin stood in the driveway, soaked and shivering. He looked at the house, my house, with the eyes of a man who finally realized he had never truly lived here. He had only occupied space I allowed him to have. He raised a hand, a weak, pleading gesture, as if asking for shelter from the very storm he had created. I placed my hand on the cool glass, feeling the vibration of Kimberly's frantic knocking. For years, I had begged for their acceptance. I had yearned for a seat at their table, for a scrap of kindness, for a moment where I wasn't the outsider. They had answered with silence, scorn, and theft. Now, they were begging for mercy, for a reprieve from the consequences of their own greed. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply turned the lock, the click echoing with finality in the foyer. Then I reached for the switch and turned off the porch light, plunging them into the darkness they had tried to cast me into for so long. I walked back toward the warmth of my home, leaving them to the rain and the wreckage of their own making. It wasn't cruelty. It was the inevitable conclusion of their choices. The gavel came down 2 weeks later, the sound sharp and definitive, echoing through the federal courtroom. Justin was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. Kimberly, though she avoided jail time through a humiliating plea deal that required her to liquidate her assets, lost everything else. The scandal shattered her social standing. The whispers she had once weaponized against me were now directed at her, a chorus of judgment she could no longer silence with money or influence. She was a pariah in the town she thought she ruled. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of the estate. It had been rebranded as the Richard and Lauren Environmental Research Center. Below me, a team of young engineers was setting up equipment for a new water filtration project, their laughter and focused chatter filling the air that used to be silent and oppressive. The grounds that had once been manicured to suffocate life were now thriving, wild and purposeful, planted with native species that filtered the soil. It had taken time to untangle myself from the wreckage. There were legal battles, media inquiries, and the quiet, persistent ache of mourning the family I had wished for but never had. But in cutting the toxic ties, I had found something far more valuable: myself. I realized that severing connection with blood isn't a loss when that blood is poisoned. It is an act of extreme self-preservation. By letting go of the need to belong to them, I found I belonged to myself. I had stopped trying to fit into their mold and started building my own foundation, brick by brick. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the evening air. It no longer smelled of jasmine and betrayal. It smelled of earth, of rain, of possibility. Letting go of bloodlines didn't make me empty. It made me free. I had reclaimed my life and turned a prison into a sanctuary. Justice isn't always about shouting. Sometimes it's about the quiet click of a locked door, I whispered to the empty air. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the savanna sky in hues of violet and gold. I turned back to my work, leaving the shadows of the past behind me. If you believe everyone deserves to be the architect of their own life, hit share and subscribe for more stories of reckoning.